Not So Obvious Watches. I'm Pete McConville. A belated part 2 to my What Happened to Swiss Watch Exports in 2019 series. Okay, so this, as I said, is my second look. The first time around I had a look at generally what happened to Swiss watch sales, and in particular what happened to mechanical versus electronic watch sales. Quickly recapping, what we saw was a fairly steady hold of the number of units shifted in the mechanical, staying inside the historic bound of like 7.2 to about 7.5 million units. We saw a cataclysmic drop of about 3 million units in the electronic watches. However, in both cases, we actually saw the amount of revenue earned rise by 2 or 3%. So across the board, you'd say really not much happened. But is that really true? Actually, now before I go on, I'll put a card up about which should link you to the next, to the last video. Go check that out for more details. But okay, now let's look at what happened in terms of where those watches that were exported from Switzerland went. Okay, so the first thing we'll notice is if we look at the regions across the board, that Africa continued to fall. Now, that's kind of irrelevant because the size of the African market is minuscule and going nowhere. It's more than anything probably a sad sign about the fact that the African economy continues to struggle almost across the entire continent, which is pretty sad, but unfortunately not really relevant to the rest of the discussion. What we also see is that sales in Europe were largely stagnant, rising by about 1 to 1.5% really across the board. Some slight falls in Eastern Europe, some slight falls in Western Europe, but across the board, that's a mature market that's not really changing a great deal, except for one subpart that we'll talk about later. What we do see is some really solid growth in the US, and Asia was, despite all the rhetoric, solid pretty much across the board. A big fall in the Middle East, which was not forecast, wasn't on anyone's radar, and in fact I'd been tipping that we were going to see rises in the Middle East, and I'm not sure what happened there. And that actually detracts a little bit because the Middle East counts as part of Asia. That counts against the overall trend in Asia. So that 2 or 3% rise that we saw in Asia would have been significantly more but for falls in the Middle East. Which is really interesting because that means we saw good growth in the Far East, which does not sit at all well with all the discussions that were had right through the year of how Hong Kong and the troubles in Hong Kong were going to be killing the market, and everyone's blamed the slightly lackluster results of 2019, or the kind of stale results of 2019 on Hong Kong. And even just looking at the regional markets, that doesn't seem to hold true. But let's dive down a little bit deeper again. So as I said, across the board, all last year, and particularly towards the end of last year, pretty much everyone was blaming soft sales in Hong Kong as the reason why the watch market was moving slowly. But if you look at the actual numbers of exports, you can see that that's simply not true. What I would say looking at this is that the troubles in Hong Kong barely affected the overall sales, overall exports of Swiss watches at all, because those exports to Hong Kong have only ever been the first link in an export chain. That Hong Kong has for decades been a hub of further export, further distribution from the Swiss factories out into the regions. So if you look at the numbers, what you can clearly see is that the fall of sales or fall of exports of watches to Hong Kong are more than made up by the movement of those sales to other parts of the region and to other well-known distribution hubs. So where did those watches move? Well, looking at the numbers, it's pretty bloody obvious. 16% growth in mainland China would indicate that a lot of the Hong Kong stock that was previously being sold to tourists from China is now just going directly to the mainland. Likewise, 19.9% growth in Japan. Now, I cannot believe that the Japanese domestic market grew by nearly 20%. Clearly, what you've got is a redirection of historic distribution hub stuff from Hong Kong now to Japan. And exactly the same thing is happening in Singapore with 14.6% rises in Singapore. If you look a bit deeper, dig a bit deeper and do some research, you can find in various news and trade publications discussions about mainland Chinese consumers not going to Hong Kong, taking their money out, and either spending it locally in the mainland or going to other regional areas like Japan, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand. Those reports are clearly illustrated or clearly reflected in the redistribution of Swiss watch exports that we see recorded here. Of course, not all of it was redistributed to local regional centres. We can see clear rises of 8.6% in the US and 10.8% in the UK. Now, some of that may be due to local economic conditions, but I strongly suspect the vast bulk of it is just a redistribution of exports from that Hong Kong and Asian market generally across to places which the Swiss watch industry felt was a safer haven. Remember late last year, suddenly people in the US and the UK started to say we could see a couple of Rolexes coming on the market. A few people were questioning whether production had gone up. A few people were talking about how quickly they were able to get things off the wait list. Well, I think we're seeing why that is now. Late in the year, there was some redistribution from the Asian market across to the US and UK markets. And for a little while, that just took a bit of pressure off the wait lists. I'd be curious to know whether that had anything to do with Richemont's sale of their inventory of Rolexes. Richemont would be as plugged into those global distribution chains as literally anyone else. They would know about these switches and swashes of market because they'd be doing it. So seeing that, it wouldn't be hard for them to guess what was going to happen to Rolex. So possibly what we saw in that late year sale of Rolexes from Richemont was a quick move of some inventory, knowing that as these new watches came into the market, someone would be wanting to flip them in 2021, and Watchfinder was just making some space. So looking at all of that and the redistribution of Swiss watch exports out of Hong Kong, and I stress redistribution, it's pretty clear to me that the impact of the troubles in Hong Kong were pretty minor, maybe a percentage point on overall sales. More concerning would probably be the fall of exports to the Middle East. Now, I have searched and searched and searched, and I can find nothing to pin that to. Economic conditions in the Middle East last year weren't great, but they also weren't terrible. They were in line with previous years. There's nothing I can find anywhere on about falls of luxury sales across the board in the Middle East. So was this just a redistribution again? The Middle East buyers are famous for making their purchases in the UK. So was this just a reallocation of resources to the UK to service those buyers? I really don't know. If you look into the country numbers, you can see a couple like the UAE and Dubai kind of held their own. But the major players, and the major player in particular, Saudi Arabia, took a massive hit. So overall, I'd really hold my breath, and I'd be curious to see what the 2020 numbers are for the Middle East before committing to anything there. Okay, so that was what happened in 2019. What do I think is going to continue to happen through 2020? Okay, we'll put the COVID-19 virus to one side. The first thing I'd say is that redistribution of luxury goods, all luxury goods out of Hong Kong, will continue. We will continue to see exports to Hong Kong plummet as luxury markets, and not just watches, but everything from handbags to perfume to jewelry, and obviously watches, will continue their exodus out of Hong Kong. I don't see that stopping at all. I see that just being redistributed around the market as it was in 2019. Now, what will happen with as a result of the COVID-19 virus, which is clearly affecting everything? I hinted at this on my last news channel, my last news update, and I really haven't changed my opinion here. I am pretty sure that what we're going to see is a reduction in export numbers. I suspect that the Swiss watch industry, there will be three things that go on here. First, a lot of the Swiss watch industry will in fact be constrained by not being able to get parts, whether that's parts of the watch or even just parts of packaging from China as fast as they need to punch out record numbers of watches. So the overall supply chain of the Swiss watch industry is going to be constrained in the first instance. Secondly, I think the Swiss watch industry across the board has learnt the lesson of don't overproduce. So not only will they be constrained, I suspect many of them will be cutting back production during this year to try and save costs and maximize returns on the watches that they make. They won't overproduce and then dump stock because ultimately that's a bit of a fool's game and you end up losing more than you make. Finally, even if they do produce at near normal levels, I suspect that they will hold back inventory as they have done previously and hold that locally rather than distribute it out to the market and force grey market sales. Again, related to this idea of it's better to not have stuff in the market than to have stuff in the market that is dumped and sold cheaply. You end up making a little bit of cash in the short term, but doing a bunch of brand equity damage in the longer term. So I don't think that's going to happen. So the upshot is I can see some softening of prices over 2020, but not a lot. I wouldn't be hanging out for some COVID-19 inspired massive plunge of sales. I just don't think it's going to happen. But anyway, I'll be curious to know what you think. I've been Pete McConville. This has been Not So Obvious Watches. If you hang on a little while, a card will come up. It's got my Instagram details. Give us a follow over there. I've cracked 500 followers on YouTube. So we're hunting for 1,000 now. So, sorry, on Instagram, hunting for 1,000 now. So go follow me over there. There's an email address. You can contact me on the email address or you DM me on Instagram. I get back to pretty much everyone who sends me a message. Anyway, I hope this has been interesting. I'll see you later. Bye.